welcome to another study on how did the Book of Mormon originate. We've been studying quite a few videos on this subject, and so I think it's very important as we study through this series that we understand the evidence that leads us to believe and know that this book did not come from God. We've been studying the textual evidence. We've seen how Sidney Rigdon incorporated many things into the Book of Mormon, such as his own theological views, such as miracles did not cease, is what he believed, and we see that incorporated into the Book of Mormon. Well, we see some other things, such as certain phrases that we see Sidney Rigdon uses throughout the Book of Mormon, which is the children of men. In fact, we find this phrase used in his own autobiography and also used in the LDS early magazines. And we want to read some of those now. In Times and Seasons, it says on page 290, this is Sidney Rigdon writing about himself. He says, "This was his prevailing characteristic, and if any sentiment was advanced by anyone that was new or tended to throw out in the Scriptures or the dealings of God with the children of men, it was always gladly received and treasured up in his mind." In another volume 4 of number 21 of Times and Seasons, page 320, "Whoso shall ask it in my name in faith, they shall cast out devils, they shall heal the sick, they shall cause the blind to receive their sight, and the deaf to hear, and the dumb to speak, and the lame to walk. And the time speedily cometh that great things shall be shown forth unto the children of men." So you can see here how we see this phrase being used over and over again. In volume 4, number 22 of Times and Seasons, "And it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Enoch, and told Enoch of all the doings of the children of men." So you can see this phrase is actually found in the 1830 Book of Mormon. It appears over 130 times. Very interesting. And so we see how there's textual evidence to support that he probably is in leagues with writing this book. Now, I want to carefully consider the third main point that we've been making. Remember that we've been talking about thus far the connection between Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon, that we see that Sidney Rigdon has stolen the manuscript of Solomon Spaulding, took it and transformed it into what is known as the Book of Mormon. Then we saw that in the Book of Mormon we could see for in itself the views that Sidney Rigdon rejected, but also the ones that he applied, that he believed in, and that were incorporated into the Book of Mormon. Now we want to deal with a third point of evidence, which is I believe, very strong, as history will indicate, and that there's this relationship between Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon before the year 1830. You see, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were established in the month of April of 1830. It wasn't until November of 1830 that we supposedly see the conversion of Sidney Rigdon to the Mormon Church. So, the question is asked, well, was that the first time Sidney Rigdon ever met Joseph Smith was after November of 1830, or was it ever before that? And as we can see, we'll see the evidence points that they had this relationship before 1830. Darwin Atwater says this about Rigdon. He says that Rigdon knew before the coming of the Book of Mormon is to me certain, from what he said of the first of his visits to my father some year before, at about the close of January 1827. He gave a wonderful description of the mounds and other antiquities found in some parts of America, and said they must have been made by the Aborigines. He said there was a book to be published containing an account of those things. He spoke of these in his eloquent, enthusiastic style as being a thing most extraordinary. Here's another person who wrote, Dr. Storm Rosa, and this person says, "In the early part of the year 1830, I was in company with Sidney Rigdon and rode with him on horseback for a few miles. He remarked to me that it was time for a new religion to spring up, that mankind were all right and ready for it." Adamson Bentley, which was his father, which was a father-in-law of him, and he says, "I know that Sidney Rigdon told me that there was a book coming out, the manuscript of which had been found engraved on gold plates, and as much as 2 years before the Mormon book made its appearance, or had been heard of by me." Thomas Clapp says this: Elder Asm Bentley told me that as he was one day riding with Sidney Rigdon and conversing upon the Bible, Mr. Rigdon told him that another book of equal authority with the Bible, as well authenticated and as ancient, which would give an account of the history of the Indian tribes on this continent, with many other things of great importance to the world, would soon be published. This was before Mormonism was ever heard of in Ohio, and when it appeared, the avidity with which Rigdon received it convinced him that if Rigdon was not the author of it, he was at least acquainted with the whole matter sometime before it was published to the world. Samuel F. Whitney states, I heard Sidney Rigdon preach in Squire Sawyer's orchard in 1827 or 1828. He said how desirable it would be to know who built the forts and mounds about that country. Soon it would all be revealed. He undoubtedly referred to the Book of Mormon, which was published in 1830. And then John Rudolph, another witness, says, for 2 years before the Book of Mormon appeared, Rigdon's sermons were full of declarations and prophecies that the age of miracles would be restored and more complete revelations than those in the Bible would be given. When the Book of Mormon appeared, all who heard him were satisfied that he referred to it. Reuben P. Harmon says, my parents came to Ohio from Vermont in 1815. I resided in Kirtland when the Mormons first arrived. I was personally acquainted with Rigdon. I've heard him several times say in his sermons that before long the Indian mounds and forts about there would all be explained. He caused a row of log houses to be built on Isaac Morley's farm and established a communistic society before Mormonism was heard of. I heard Rigdon preach his first sermon of Kirtland Flats, and after he embraced Mormonism, he said he had been preaching wrong doctrine and asked their forgiveness. Now, it could be possible that Sidney Rigdon, he might have just, heard this from newspapers, because newspapers were at this time reporting the events that were surrounding Joseph Smith, and that Joseph Smith was going to be translating the Book of Mormon. And so maybe Sidney Rigdon had taken these newspaper accounts and just, told everybody about what's going on in the world. Well, what's really interesting is that the newspapers that were published in Rochester, New York on August 31st and September 5th, 1829, indicated that Smith's activities were known in Palmyra and the vicinity as early as the fall of 1827. Now that's very important, because it was sometime before 1827 with some of these witnesses that Sidney Rigdon had told that the Book of Mormon was coming out. Let me just give you these pictures real quick. You can see the newspaper accounts. The Rochester Daily Advertiser and Telegraph. It says at the top, August 31st, 1829, in which it's going to talk about the account of Joseph Smith and his Golden Bible, also known as the Book of Mormon. There's also the Telegraph, November 16th, 1830. We find also the Painesville Telegraph, which is September 22nd, 1829. We also find the Lorraine Gazette, May 21st, 1830. So you can see all these accounts, newspaper accounts that are around this time, around 1829, 1830. And then you have the Cincinnati Advertiser in Ohio, Phoenix, and it says June 2nd, 1830. And so what's really interesting about these newspaper articles is suggests some level of public knowledge of Smith before 1829. And the earliest newspaper articles that we have are only found in that only part of 1829. But this would not explain, Rigdon's foreknowledge of the Book of Mormon before 1829. So would you not see that possibly Sidney Rigdon knew about this book all along? Amos Hayden, he writes in his book on the biography of the disciples on the Western Reserve, he said, Rigdon introduced an argument to show that our pretensions to follow the apostles and their New Testament teachings required a community of goods, that as they established this order in the model church at Jerusalem, we were bound to imitate their example. Well, what's really interesting is what Alma B. Green writes about this meeting, and he says, in the annual meeting of the Mahoning Associate held in Austintown in August 1830, about 2 months before Sidney Rigdon's professed conversion to Mormonism, Rigdon preached Saturday afternoon. He had much to say about a full and complete restoration of the ancient gospel. He spoke in his flowing style of what the disciples had accomplished, but contended that we had not accomplished a complete restoration of the apostolic Christianity. He contended that such restoration must include community goods, holding all in common stock, and a restoration of the spiritual gifts of the apostolic age. He promised that although we had not come up to the apostolic plane in full yet, as we were improving, God would soon give us a new and fuller revelation of His will. After the Book of Mormon had been read by many who heard Rigdon on the occasion, they were perfectly satisfied that Rigdon knew all about that book when he preached that discourse. Rigdon's sermon was most thoroughly refuted by Brother Campbell, which very much offended Rigdon. So you can see how there was these witnesses who said, Sidney Rigdon, he knew about the Book of Mormon coming forth even before 1829. And so you can see how we see that we're filling in the jigsaw pieces of the puzzle, and that it's all coming together of where the Book of Mormon truly did originate. Well, we find in the book called The Origin of Mormonism, Mrs. Eaton writes this. She says, early in the summer of 1827, a mysterious stranger seeks admission to Joe Smith's cabin. The conferences of the two are most private. This person whose coming immediately preceded a new departure in the faith was Sidney Rigdon, a backslidden clergyman, then a Campbellite preacher in Mentor, Ohio. Well, we find also another man who was believed to have seen Sidney Rigdon with Joseph Smith. And he says, as a matter too well to need argument that Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, and Sidney Rigdon were acquaintance for a considerable time before Mormonism was first heard of. Because we see that there were some men who were living at the time who saw Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon together. Let me read you Pomeroy Tucker's account. He says, a mysterious stranger now appears at Smith's and holds intercourse with the famed money digger. For a considerable time, no intimation of the name or purpose of the stranger transpired to the public, not even the Smiths' nearest neighbors. It was observed by some that his visits were frequently repeated. The sequel of the intimacies of this stranger and the money digger will sufficiently appear hereafter. There was a great consternation when the 118 pages of manuscript were stolen from Harris, for it seemed to have been impossible, for some unaccountable reason, to retranslate the stolen portion. The reappearance of this mysterious stranger at Smith's at this juncture was again the subject of inquiry and conjecture by observers from whom was withheld all explanations of his identity and purpose. When the Book of Mormon appeared, Rigdon was an early convert. Up to this time he had played his part in the background, and his occasional visits to Smith's had been observed by the inhabitants as those of the mysterious stranger. It had been his policy to remain in concealment until all things were in readiness for blowing the trumpet of the new gospel. He now came to the front as the first regular preacher in Palmyra. Well, we also see another witness that says that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon had a relationship before November of 1830, and that was Mrs. Anderwick. Listen to what she says. I was born in New York State near the Massachusetts line, May 7th, 1809. In 1812, my parents moved to a farm 2 miles from the village and in the township of Palmyra, New York. In 1823, Mother died, and I went to her sister's, Mrs. Il Wilcox, where I lived much of the time until December 1828, when I went to live with Father, who had again married and settled on a farm on the Holland Patent, 20 miles west of Rochester, New York. Uncle Earl's farm was 4 miles south of Palmyra village, and his house was near the opposite of old Joe Smith's, father of the Mormon prophet. Old Joe was dissipated. He and his son Hiram worked some all at coopering. Hiram was the only son sufficiently educated to teach school. I attended when he taught in the log schoolhouse east of Uncle's. He also taught in the Stafford district. He and Sophorina were the most respected of the family, who were not much thought of in the community. They cleared the timber from only a small part of their farm and never paid for the land. They tried to live without work. I've often heard the neighbors say that they did not know how the Smiths lived. They earned so little money. The farmers who lived near the Smiths had many sheep and much poultry stolen. They often sent officers to search the premises of the Smiths for stolen property, who usually found the house locked. It was said the creek near the house of the Smiths was lined with the feet and heads of sheep. Uncle's children were all sons, and they played with Smith's younger children. I associated much with Sophorina Smith, the oldest daughter, as she was the only girl near my age, who lived in our vicinity. I often accompanied her, Hiram, and young Joe Smith, who became the Mormon prophet, to apple pairings and parties. Joe was pompous, but pretentious and active at parties. He claimed when a young man he could tell where lost or hidden things and treasures were buried or located with a forked witch hazel. He deceived many farmers and induced them to dig nights for chests of gold. When the pick struck the chest, someone usually spoke, and Joe would say the enchantment was broken and the chests would leave. Willard Chase, a Methodist who lived about 2 miles from Uncle's while digging a well, found a gray smooth stone about the size and shape of an egg. Sally, Willard's sister, also a Methodist, told me several times that young Joe Smith, who became the Mormon prophet, often came to inquire of her where to dig for treasures. She told me she would place the stone in a hat and hold it to her face and claim things would be brought to her view. Sally let me have it several times, but I never could see anything in or through it. I heard that Joe obtained it and called it a peepstone, which he used in the place of the witch hazel. Uncle refused to let Joe dig on his farm. I have seen many holes where he dug on other farms. When Joe joined the Presbyterian Church in Palmyra Village, it caused much talk and surprise as he claimed to receive revelations from the Lord. He also claimed he found some gold plates with characters on them in a hill between Uncle's and Father's, which I often crossed. Several times I saw what he claimed were the plates, which were covered with a cloth. They appear to be 6 or 8 inches square. He frequently carried them with him. I heard they kept them under the brick's hearth. He was from home much summers. Sometimes he said he had been to Broome County, New York, and Pennsylvania. Several times while I was visiting to Sophrina Smith at old Joe's house, she told me that a stranger who I saw there several times in warm weather and several months apart was Mr. Rigdon. At other times the Smith children told me that Mr. Rigdon was at their house when I did not see him. I did not read much in the Book of Mormon because I had no confidence in Joe. Palmyra people claimed that Joe did not know enough to be the author of the Book of Mormon and believed that Rigdon was its author. I was acquainted with most of the people about us and with Martin Harris. On my way to California, I stopped in Salt Lake City from July 1852 until March 1853. I received much attention from Mormon ladies because I was acquainted and had danced with their prophet. And so you can see this, what she was writing, how she saw this mysterious stranger, and she identified him as Sidney Rigdon. Well, what about W.A. Lilly? This person says, I was born in Trumbull County, Ohio in 1815. Our family moved to Chester, the town adjoining Kirtland on the south, in 1822. In about 1834, Mr. Pern of Chester told me he used to live in the neighborhood of the Mormon Smith family in Palmyra, New York, and was well acquainted with all of them. He said they were a low family of no account in the community. He told me the summer before Joe Smith, the Mormon prophet, first came to Ohio, he often saw Smith and Rigdon together. It was the first time he knew of Rigdon, and it was before the Book of Mormon was published. He saw Smith and Rigdon start together in a buggy for Ohio. Mr. Pern knew Rigdon well after coming to Ohio and said he believed he was at the bottom of Mormonism. My father borrowed the Book of Mormon, and when he had finished reading, it laughed and it remarked Rigdon had done pretty well. We have another person who says that Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith were working together for 1830. Erasmus Turner says the enlarging of original intentions, that transformation from a money-making scheme to a religious endeavor, was at the suggestion of Sidney Rigdon of Ohio, who made his appearance about the time the book was issued from the press. He unworthily bore the title of a Baptist elder, but had by some time previously, Freak, if the author is rightly informed, forfeited his standing with that respectable religious denomination. Then we have Abel D. Chase, and he had a couple of statements he made. He says, I, Abel D. Chase, now living in Palmyra, Wayne County, New York, make the following statement regarding my early acquaintance with Joseph Smith and the incidents about the production of the so-called Mormon Bible. I was well acquainted with the Smith family, frequently visiting the Smith boys and they me. I was a youth at the time, from 12 to 13 years old, having been born January 19, 1814, at Palmyra, New York. During some of my visits at the Smiths, I saw a stranger there who said that it was Mr. Rigdon. He was at Smith's several times, and it was said in the year of 1827 when I first saw him there, as many as I was recollected. Sometime after that, tales were circulated that young Joe had found or dug from the earth a book of plates, which the Smiths called the Golden Bible. I don't think Smith had any such plates. He was mysterious in his actions. The peepstone in which he was accustomed to look, he got at my elder brother Willard while at work for us digging a well. It was a singular-looking stone, and young Joe pretended he could discover hidden things in it. My brother Willard Chase died at Palmyra, New York, March 10, 1871. His affidavit, published in Howe's History of Mormonism, is genuine. Peter Ingersoll, whose affidavit was published in the same book, is also dead. He moved west years ago and died about 2 years ago. Ingersoll had the reputation of being a man of his word, and I have no doubt his sworn statement regarding the Smiths and the Mormon Bible is genuine. I was also well acquainted with Thomas P. Baldwin, a lawyer and notary public, and Frederick Smith, the lawyer and magistrate before whom Chase's and Ingersoll's depositions were made, and who were residents of this village at the time and for several years after. Well, we see also another witness who saw them together was Lorenzo Saunders. Listen to his statements. He says, last evening, I had about 15 minutes conversation with Mr. Lorenzo Saunders of Reading, Hillsdale County, Michigan. He had been gone about 30 years from the Palmyra area. He was born south of our village in 1811, was a near neighbor of the Smith family, knew them all well, was in the habit of visiting the Smith boys, says he knows that Rigdon was hanging around Smith's for 18 months prior to the publishing of the Mormon Bible. Here's statement 2 that he had. It says the following interview was had with Lorenzo Saunders by W.M.H. Kelly at Mr. L. Saunders' house, September 17, 1884, at the above named place, which is read and signed by Mr. Saunders as being correct. Question, how old are you, Mr. Saunders? Answer, I was born in Palmyra, Wayne County, New York, June 7, 1811. Question, did you ever see Sidney Rigdon in the neighborhood where you lived previously to 1830? Yes, in March 1827. I went over to Joe Smith's to eat supper, and as I went over, I saw about 20 rods from the house, 5 or 6 men standing and talking. One was well dressed. Did you know their names? Yes, it was Peter Ingersoll, Samuel Lawrence, George Popper, the old man Rockwell, father of Porter Rockwell, and the well-dressed man. They stood 10 rods from the road. When I got to the house, Harrison Smith told me that it was Sidney Rigdon, the well-dressed man. Did you see him after that previous to 1830? Yes, I saw him in the fall just before Joseph went to Pennsylvania, December of 1827. Peter Ingersoll and I met him in the road between Palmyra and Ingersoll's. I never saw him anymore until he came to Palmyra to preach the Mormon Bible. Are you acquainted with Major Gilbert of Palmyra? Yes, 4 years ago I went to Palmyra to see my brothers, and I met Gilbert. He wanted to know if I remember seeing Sidney Rigdon in that neighborhood previous to 1830 when he came preaching the Mormon Bible. He said Abel Chase testified that he thought he saw Rigdon before that time, but was not certain. Said I to Gilbert, Sidney Rigdon was about Smith's before 1830 in my opinion. Gilbert asked if I would make affidavit that I saw Rigdon at Smith's before that time. I told him that I would think the matter over. After a while, I think I told him I would, and after I got home a while, I received a letter from Cobb of Salt Lake. Gilbert wrote to Cobb and gave him my address. I wrote to Cobb the next spring. Gilbert wrote to me, I think in November, after I returned home, asking why I did not answer Cobb's letter. While I was writing an answer to Cobb's, the first letter, my house caught fire and burnt. Burned up everything I had, and there was no insurance. Lost $1,000. I was sometime thinking the matter over before writing to Cobb, and during that time, my house burned. It's been a long time since those transactions. It was difficult to fix dates. But I have it now, so I can tell it right off. I have read the statements of Peter Ingersoll and Samuel Lawrence. And then he says this in another statement, January 28, 1885. Dear Sir, I received your note ready at hand and will try to answer the best I can and give all the information I can as respecting Mormonism in the first origin. I saw Sidney Rigdon in the spring of 1827, about the middle of March, and I went to Smith's to eat maple sugar. And I saw 5 or 6 men standing in a group, and there was one among them better dressed than the rest. And I asked Harrison Smith who he was, and he said his name was Sidney Rigdon, a friend of Joseph from Pennsylvania. I saw him in the fall of 1827 on the road between where I lived and Palmyra with Joseph. I was with a man by the name of Ingersoll. They talked together, and when he went on, I asked Ingersoll who he was, and he said it was Rigdon. And in the summer of 1828, I saw him at Samuel Lawrence's just before harvest. I was cutting corn for Lawrence and went to dinner, and he took dinner with us. And when dinner was over, they went into another room, and I didn't see him again until he came to Palmyra to preach. And then one of the other statements Lorenzo Saunders gave is found in July 21st, 1887. It says, Lorenzo Saunders, being duly sworn, deposes and says that I reside in Reading, Hillsdale County, State of Michigan, that I was born in the town of Palmyra, Wayne County, State of New York, on June 7th, 1811, and am now 76 years of age, that I lived in said town of Palmyra until I was 43 years of age. That I lived within 1 mile of Joseph Smith at the time. Said Joseph Smith claimed that he had found the tablets on which the Book of Mormon was revealed. Then in March of 1827, or about the 15th of said month, I went to the home of Joseph Smith for the purpose of getting some maple sugar to eat. And that when I arrived at the house of said Joseph Smith, I was met at the door by Harrison Smith, Joe's brother. That at a distance of 10 or 12 rods from the house, there were 5 men that were engaged in talking, 4 of whom I knew. The fifth one was better dressed than the rest of those whom I was acquainted with. I inquired of Harrison Smith who the stranger was. He informed me his name was Sidney Rigdon, with whom I afterwards became acquainted with and found to be Sidney Rigdon. This was in March 1827, the second spring after the death of my father. I was frequently at the house of Joseph Smith from 1827 to 1830. In the summer of 1830, I heard Sidney Rigdon preach a sermon on Mormonism. This was after the Book of Mormon had been published, which took about 3 years from the time Joseph Smith claimed to have had his revelation. And so we see that Lorenzo Saunders and many other men who lived in Palmyra, they said, you know, we recognize that there was this man named Sidney Rigdon who often came to visit Joseph Smith. Now, like we've said before, supposedly Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon never met until November of 1830 or a little times after that. And you can see that here are these witnesses who say, you know, these men were actually together. And we have Sidney Rigdon, who had been spouting off saying that there's a new book, there's this new religion that's going to come. And no doubt he had foreknowledge of the Book of Mormon that was about to come, even before all those newspaper accounts talked about it. How did he know? Unless he was the one who instigated it, unless he was the one who was the early founder of what we would call the Mormon religion. And so, friend, you've seen the evidence. You've seen how men try to sadly bring about new religions that are not from God. And the question is, which one will you follow? Will you follow the religion of true Christianity found in the Bible, or will you follow a false religion which is found in the Book of Mormon?